Okay, I believe everyone is here. There's a few people perhaps trickling in, but I want to welcome you here to the MCAS-Alt for students who are using Access Skill. I want to make sure you know that this will be recorded. It will not be posted for at least a week to 10 days, but all the material that you need, if you want to look at the PowerPoint, it'll all be in the material site for you, which we'll put in the chat. I'm going to ask you to refrain from asking questions during the presentation. I want you to pay close attention, so jot down any questions you have because we will have time at the end to take your questions. We do have our teacher consultants here to help answer the questions, and today we have Laura Hines, who is also one of our teacher consultants, but she has real life experience with students using Access Skills. And she actually came to this process kicking and screaming. So she has a lot to share with you. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Hines, as Deb said, and I'm talking to you today about Access Skills and how to document Access Skills in your MCAS-Alt binders. So I'm going to shut my video off and turn this over to the interpreter so that you'll have a big view of the slides. I'll catch up with you in the end for questions. So I'm sure you've seen this graphic used to explain how the resource guide is organized. It shows the bean men climbing up building block steps to reach the heights of grade level standards. And I like it because it acknowledges that some students lack the earliest motor or communication skills and need that ramp to even make it to the lowest step. Those kids are working on Access Skills. But before I talk about Access Skills, I want to take a quick minute to talk about what Access Skills are not and to take a little look at that bottom step and explore some of the entry points that are found there. This is how the resource guide is organized, and it begins with grade level standards as written and breaks down the standard into entry points that have been vetted by the content area experts into increasingly less complex skills so that all students of all different abilities can enter into the curriculum at a level that's challenging but appropriate for them. So again, before we talk about Access Skills, I want to take a minute to talk about that bottom step. Some teachers, recognizing the significant challenges that their students face, are inclined to go directly to the lowest available entry points and select one for their students and start with Access Skills. And back when we had these training sessions in person, people often shared their frustrations about teaching academic content to students with significant medical challenges who are also deaf and blind and who slept most of the day due to being heavily medicated to prevent seizures. So while we were sitting around those tables, invariably, another frustrated teacher would come and join our group because they had an Access student too. And we Access teachers, perhaps out of necessity, are great supports to one another. And the group would always ask the teacher approaching our table if their student had an established communication system. And sometimes the newly arrived teacher would respond, well, my student talks. And then the group would ask if that student had any volitional movement. And the newly arrived teacher would say, well, he writes, but he's in the 6th grade. So even though we acknowledge that developing curriculum for students that are significantly below average is challenging, if your student has speech, he most likely is not an Access student. Kids working at Access level are sometimes referred to as the 1% of the 1%. It really is a very small group. And so let me share you some more examples of who is not addressing Access Skills. So a 10th grade student who is reading at a 1st grade level is not addressing the curriculum and Access level, really. So you want to look for low level entry points, and many of them seem very, very distant from the expectations of typical 10th grade students. But the resource guide has done a great job of breaking apart those standards so that students with even very limited language can enter into the curriculum. Or how about that 8th grade student with significant behavioral issues who refuses to write and who will only shout answers from under the desk? He's probably not addressing the curriculum at an Access level either, really. For students with behavioral challenges that interfere with participation in those academic assignments, low entry points may be the just right challenge. And again, I'm not saying this is easy, but it may be possible. So for those students, you want to consider reducing the academic demands and capturing the student responses on those teacher documented work samples we'll talk about later, whenever you have a teaching opportunity. And even if the answer is shouted from under a desk, that third bullet, these students can address academic content. So here's a couple more. If you have a sixth grade student with an emerging communication system who can only answer questions by eye gaze to the correct response from a field of 3 icons, they're not addressing curriculum at an access level. Let me put it this way. The response format is not the skill. What makes this right or wrong is not the student's eye gazing. Based on this brief description, it appears that the data is recording the student's accuracy choosing the correct answer to a question. So if you're taking data on their ability to eye gaze to a particular picture to demonstrate comprehension of something that they just heard read aloud, that's an entry point. You're asking the students to identify the character in a literary text. Even if they're using eye gaze, isn't that what they're showing? But you might also have a student that you're tracking data on them just looking at any picture from the story. And if you have a student like that, that's an access skill. So for some students with significant cognitive challenges, just getting them to track and attend, that's an important skill. So let me just tell you that, try to come up with an example that kind of shows the difference between those two students. So Lindsay was one of my students who was all personality, and she drew people to her like a magnet. Her laugh was infectious, and even though as teachers we don't have favorites. If I was on the screen right now, you'd see me winking because she was just one of those kinds of kids. And folks that knew Lindsay well knew that she communicated with facial expressions, and we knew with a different pitch vocalizations what they meant and what she was trying to convey. But we all knew that she deserved to have a formalized communication method so that she could express the many, many thoughts and ideas that we knew we had. And we were desperate to find a reliable switch site, and we tried all kinds of strategies to see if she could make choices through eye gaze or pointing at icons, but her tone was really, really limited her responses. I mean, this was the kiddo who, broke one headrest a year because she had such great tone. And we spent an entire MCAS-Alt cycle tracking her ability to eye gaze to a target that we placed in all different positions, in all different sizes, in all different backgrounds with different colors or lighting, and seeing if the movements or distance from her made any difference. And the results were really variable, but that's common in our business, right? So that year, Lindsay was just working on eye gazing, and it was an access skill. And then the following year, I asked the para to set up a story and record some data for Lindsay because I knew we had to start early. And the para mistakenly used the pictures that I had set up for another student and recorded the data on a teacher documented work samples, asking questions with 2 pictures to choose from the answer. But you can see where I'm going with this. So the para showed me the data, and I was, I just couldn't even believe it, because even though the data wasn't great, after a year working on just looking at the target, which is an access skill, on that sample, Lindsay was using her eye gaze to make a choice to identify the character from a field of 2. That's an entry point. And, the look on Lindsay's face when I asked her if she was really answering questions really was something else. So it seems clear to me that the line between access skills and low entry can be difficult to ascertain. But let's take a look at this 3rd grade student. So this 3rd grade, I hope that I made that clear. Anyway, a 3rd grade student who's being marked inaccurate for grasping the wrong manipulative when asked to match a shape on a piece of paper is also not addressing the curriculum at access level. You have to look at what the teacher's testing, what makes the student right or wrong. So from this brief description, it appears the student marked, the answer was marked wrong because the student was selecting the shape that doesn't match. That's an entry point. Match two shapes from different materials. That's an entry point. But there is a geometry access point about grasping. There's one that says grasping geometric shapes. So if the student was given an activity where it didn't matter what the shape was that they were choosing, if they just had to pick any shape within an expected latency period, that would be an access skill. So you see that the low level entry points and the high level access skills are somewhat related, but they are different. So in other words, let me put this another way. The resource guide has a myriad of rich, interesting, low-level entry points. And sometimes it feels like a giant stretch to consider that 10th grade student who's a virtual non-reader can be addressing the entry point. But that's exactly the underpinning of this whole process. Students can address grade level standards, but at entry points that are appropriate to their level. So don't get too hung up on identifying which grade level standard the entry point aligns to. If you choose an entry point within the required standard domain, it's acceptable. Because entry points have been vetted by the content area experts. So like look at these examples of low-level entry points. Match words or pictures to objects or icons. That's an entry point. Identify the main character in a literary text, and a student may do that by pointing or eye-gazing or vocalizing. Answering yes/no questions related to numbers, quantities, or counting. That too can be an entry point. Entry points provide students working well below grade level expectations with opportunities to enter the curriculum, and sometimes at very, very early starting points. And if you're struggling to find an entry point for your student, and your student has language, you might want to contact Deb at the department, and she might be able to help you find one. But that being said, many students do need that ramp. Access skills are appropriate for a very small number of students with the most complex and significant cognitive disabilities. So for those of you who have students that don't have symbolic communication, they don't have motor skills that allow them to currently address academic content, and they're just addressing developmental milestones, the rest of this presentation will show you how you can complete an access portfolio. So, although a student's IEP objectives may be overriding learning focus for that student, providing him or her with the opportunity to practice those objectives in the context of the general curriculum, the general classroom, and to receive instruction on those objectives in the context of general education activities represents one fundamental way of ensuring that students with significant disabilities do participate in the general curriculum. So this quote reminds me that practicing the skills in the context of the general curriculum is not just the law, but it's one way of promoting equity and inclusion. Okay, there it is. Do I believe it? Well, when I was in the classroom, my students had IEPs that traditionally addressed ADLs or motor skills and focused on increasing engagement in building social skills. Academic skills were considered outside the zone of proximal development for my students. And especially in the beginning, I was really frustrated with the idea of how I could have my students participate in any meaningful way in statewide assessment. And at that time, a common IEP objective was toothbrushing, which is not a standards-based activity. I must admit that this toothbrushing goal was pretty common, and I didn't often make progress with that goal. I mean, toothbrushing was only practiced once a day, and maybe if the OT was in the building, it might have got practiced a little bit more. And my students were tactily defensive, or they lacked tone, and they were really unmotivated to hold objects. So toothbrushing was really not something that I was really good at helping my students do better. So then I took a look. What's the critical skill in toothbrushing? Well, I wanted to see that focusing on the critical skill of grasping was really helpful to me. And so when I reframed this goal, instead of, grasping a toothbrush, when I reframed the goal into that given a tool, he'll grasp it for 2 to 4 seconds without dropping it, I found ways to practice this skill across all contents all day. And I found ways to incorporate grasping across the curriculum. For example, when my student was grasping cylindrical objects in counting activities, I could do that in math. And I found grasping cylindrical object characters that I made out of clothespins that I called characters from the story was something that they could do to read a story, a poem, a folktale, or a myth. And in science investigations, I found that there were things that they were also able to grasp. I'm not saying that my students learned much of the academic content in these areas, but I did find that learning was more fun and age appropriate, and I sometimes discovered unintended positive outcomes from having these higher expectations. And then I also saw improvements in the critical skill of grasping in non-academic activities. So it was a win-win. So grasping and other developmental milestones are access skills. So in the resource guide and the Forms and Graphs program, you'll find a robust list of access skills that you can use to create your measurable outcomes. So let's just look at this one, for example. Locate objects partially hidden or out of sight to expose a ratio. Use one object to act on another used to demonstrate ratios. Turn on technology used to demonstrate ratios and proportional relationships. Lotta. So you can notice that all of these access skills are developmental milestones practiced in the context of a specific academic context. So as I said, there's no expectation that the student's going to be tested about ratios, but the expectation is that in all of these occasions where the data is going to be taken on, the skill for the purpose of the binder is grasping, and though that grasping will be done in the context of ratios activities. So that's how you choose your that's where you're going to choose the access skills. And then after you choose the access skill, you're going to create it into a measurable outcome. So let's get started and see what I mean. So first, to even get to this, the strand, you're going to have to fill out your skill survey. So after you look at the range of skills, if your student is unable to perform any of them, you're going to find my student is unable to perform any of these skills at the bottom of the list. And you can check that, and that's how you can build your skills survey for access students. And then you're going to review the list of access skills available. And once you choose your access skill, you're going to create a measurable outcome. Now, can we have the next slide? So when you're creating a measurable outcome from an access skill, it's important that you specify accuracy criteria to ensure reliable data. So compiling a MCAS binder is optimally a group effort, and hopefully you can rely on some paras or some specialists to assist with the data collection. And everyone needs to be collecting data using this same frame, because in the absence of shared criteria that the students successfully completing the task, the data collection is unreliable. So you can see on this one, the students turning on technology to demonstrate ratios, by pressing an access switch within 15 seconds of the directive. And then, of course, the mastery for the task is when you're moving on and you're no longer going to work on turning on technology within 15 seconds. You might change the latency or something, but within 15 seconds of the director is the criteria that we know whether or not the student successfully performed this task. And I want to share an example of why that's so important. For a while, I had a student that was going to activate a switch to conduct a survey. And when I was working with the student, the data was all over the place. But when he worked with the para, the data was awesome. So I thought it was a good idea to shadow the para and the student and see what switch site they were using that was so reliable. And so I, followed them outside the classroom, and they knocked on the first office door, and the para announced that John was there to ask the polling question. And then the para chatted with the secretary for a few minutes until John, who was seated in his wheelchair, coughed. And predictably, when he coughed, his head switch was activated, and the para turned to me with a look that said 100% accurate and 100% independent. And that's how I knew that we needed to have a more consistent criteria. So once you've got a skill survey conducted and the measurable outcome has been determined with good criteria, putting together an access skill is not unlike putting together a strand that addresses entry points. You need the strand cover sheet, the skill survey, the data chart, and then the 2 pieces of evidence. So that seems pretty straightforward, but there's always a but. There it is. The one thing that might seem a little bit different is when you're looking at your data chart. Just a quick thought on data charts. There's advantages of each type of data chart, and it's totally personal preference which one you choose. A line graph doesn't use much printer ink, which is nice in some schools. The bar graph is really clear to show parents. And the field data chart is great to use if you're tracking student responses during discrete trials. So whichever one you pick, it's totally up to you, but you only pick one data chart per strand. But there is, and that's not different than the entry points, but there is one thing that might require a little more attention when you're compiling an access portfolio, is how you write your clear, brief description. So here's a field data chart, and let's take a closer look at some of these clear, brief descriptions. So here's one that the measurable outcome is choose from an array of 2 errorless choices within 15 seconds of a directive related to vocabulary acquisition. Okay, so that was the measurable outcome. So the important takeaway on this slide is this brief description. And everybody knows that the brief description includes the what, which is the skill, and the how, which is the activity. But when you're crafting a brief description of an access skill, it's also important to include not only the what, the developmental skill that you chose, like, switch activation or grasping or releasing, but you also have to, in the how of the activity, that it was a Go Fish game or a worksheet or a poster. You also have to include how this activity links to the standard. And many of the access points have the standard of the topic embedded in it. And this one specifies that the errorless choice is related to vocabulary. So let's review these examples. In the first example, the teacher wrote that the student made an errorless choice on an errorless choice to play synonym Go Fish. If they just said that they were going to do an errorless choice to play Go Fish, if the errorless choice was the activity and the activity was Go Fish, and they didn't include that it was a synonym Go Fish game, it might not have been really clear how that related to the measurable outcome. And in the second one, choose from an array of errorless choices. That's the, what, and the how is to do a worksheet. If they didn't note that it was a synonym worksheet, it might not have been really clear how that related to that measurable outcome. So to be really clear, when writing access brief descriptions, you want to make sure that you've included the skill, the standard, and the activity. Now, I want to take a hot minute here too and discuss the access skill of errorless choice. There's been a lot of confusion about what it is, why it's used, and how it's scored. So I want to ask a question about this from all of you. Are you familiar with the term errorless choice? Can you just take a minute and answer this poll question? You can say yes, no, or maybe I could use a refresher just so I can know that we're all kind of coming from the same point of view. We need some music here. Are they answering, Erin?
Yep, we have about 85% going up a little bit. So we'll just give folks a second and then I can end the poll. All right, I think we have a pretty good response rate, so I'll end it now.
So it looks like 60% of you have used errorless choices, and 16% are completely unfamiliar with this, but 24% of you say you could use a refresher. So because I have a slide on it, we'll do a refresher. Errorless choice. So teachers may have students working on errorless choices within a specified amount of time to encourage students to respond and engage in lessons. And either choice is correct. So the answer the students select is not what makes it right or wrong. In an errorless choice, the answer is scored incorrect if the student does not make a choice, typically within a specified amount of time. This may be an appropriate entry point for students with emerging communication systems. If their choice making is not reliable indicators of the student's actual preferences, teachers can use implied intentionality as a means of shaping cause and effect behavior in building expressive communication. For example, do you want the tambourine or the maraca? And the student, reaches for the tambourine, and as soon as he has it, throws it on the floor, that perhaps that might not have been a reliable choice. So again, errorless choices have a significance in helping build that, building some of that cause and effect. And teachers can also use the data to look for to see things that motivate or exchange students or discover patterns in student responses, a left or right-sided preference, color, size, textural preferences, more reliable switch choices. They can do it to build confidence. They can do it to increase participation. And while if you're going to go to all the bother of creating a teacher documented work sample, you might want to include comments to record useful information that you're using to drive instruction from the errorless choices that your kids are making. So for example, when we did an Access presentation, I talked about the writing presentation. I hope that all of you have had a chance to see the writing Access presentation. It will be offered again, I think, tomorrow. But in the writing Access presentation, I talked about a narrative text type could be about facts from a lesson that the kids had. And I suggested that the teacher might create fill-in-the-blank templates to see what resonated with the students after a lesson. So, for example, if you were doing that landfill exercise from the garbage unit, a fill-in-the-blank writing question that was errorless might be, I like crushing the blank blank Oreos, or I liked crushing the styrofoam cup. I mean, either answer would be correct in the fill-in-the-blank activity. But if you had a fill-in-the-blank activity after that, in which the question was a fill-in-the-blank activity about which objects in the mini landfill changed, that would not be an errorless choice. There's a right answer and a wrong answer. So that would be more of a that would be an entry point fill-in-the-blank activity. So again, consider what makes the answer right or wrong. So in a tabletop activity where the student's measurable outcome is making an errorless choice in an addition activity, showing how sets can be put together, asking the student if they want to use bears or blocks to add, that would be an errorless choice. So for the purpose of MCAS-Alt, errorless choices are marked incorrect if the student doesn't choose bears or blocks within a specified amount of time, or they didn't respond at all. But in a tabletop activity that's showing how sets can be put together, and the teacher puts down 3 + 2 bears and asks how many, that's not errorless. There's only one answer, and that's 5. So that student would be working on entry. So when you're doing errorless choices, make sure you consider that what makes it right or wrong, and that if it's an errorless choice activity, that the choices are in fact errorless. All right, let's move on. I started talking about teacher documented work samples, because these are how you're going to show those 2 pieces of evidence that we talked about that are required to make a strand complete. So a teacher documented work sample, it's going to have the label with the name, date, and overall accuracy. It's going to document a series of trials conducted over the same time, and it's going to specifically show the materials and the context of the activity. I always say that a teacher documented work sample answers the question, can someone who doesn't know anything about special education look at this piece of work and know exactly what the student was asked to do and how the student responded? Is it clear how the accuracy and the independence was determined? That would be a good teacher documented work sample. So let's look at some examples of that. So this one, this type of teacher documented work sample appears to be an expanded field data chart, but it has a lot more than just a field data chart. So let's review the sample. So the measurable outcome is within 15 seconds of instruction, the student's going to give materials to be counted. So the first trial says, give 1 block to the teacher while the teacher labeled 1. When the teacher said, give me 1, and the score says plus, and he said independently. So from looking at that and knowing how important latency is, I know that the student gave the block within 15 seconds. So then the second trial is give 1 block to the teacher when the teacher said, give me 1, and the teacher labels it as 2. And again, the student response was plus, and the kiddo did it independently. So you can see exactly what I can see from looking at this, exactly what the student was required to do and how the teacher did it. Now, the teacher could have also included a latency comment in this sample so that we would have seen how long it took her to track the student's response. And I suggest that if you're going to go to the bother of creating a teacher documented work sample, consider setting it up so that you can capture the information that's going to be valuable to you to inform your teaching. So you can see, maybe I don't need to have such a long wait time as 15 seconds. Maybe I could, move on after 5 seconds, or maybe, so many of these are incorrect at 15 seconds, but if I had just waited to 25 seconds, the student is more accurate. So consider building teacher documented work samples that are going to give you information. You can note that the teacher also built in opportunities for self-evaluation right on this worksheet on the side, where after the trial, when shown pieces of work to stop, work and stop, the kiddo can choose an answer. And I'll talk a little bit more about self-evaluation later on, but let's look at the bottom half of this slide. So you can see look at this sample and see exactly how the accuracy and the independence was calculated. And if this teacher was including this work sample on her data chart, she might write some kind of a brief description that might say something like, the student gave the blocks to teacher 1 at a time as the teacher was counting during a tabletop activity. So you can see exactly what the skill was that the student's giving, and it's a tabletop activity, and it was a tabletop activity about counting. So you can see that you would need to be sure to include the skill, the standard, and the activity in your brief description. Here's one more teacher documented work sample that looks much like a field data chart. So in this one, the measurable outcome is the student will turn on technology used to demonstrate ratios and proportional relationships by pressing a switch within 15 seconds of the directive. So this teacher put in a lot of stuff on here. They have the trial number, the page number. Did they turn on the technology, pressing the switch to activate the reading? It shows the latency in seconds. They show what was on each page. They show the students a separate column for the accuracy, a special column for the independence. So you can see exactly what they were doing. This teacher also submitted this next slide as secondary evidence. Let's take a look at this. So secondary or supporting documentation of a teacher documented work sample doesn't show the final product or how the student participated, but it gives some more information about the context of the activity. So between looking at this picture of what was on each slide on the computer and that other slide, I can see exactly what this student was doing. So around the farm, for every sheep, there are 2 ears. For every duck, there is 1 beak. For every horse, there are 4 legs. You can see exactly what the student was doing here. So, in fact, the teacher could have included just this picture of these thumbnails of the slide if she'd included the latency, the accuracy, and the independent on each thumbnail. This sample alone would have been an acceptable teacher documented work sample. And can you also see how this piece of evidence could also be used in the reading informational text strand? especially for our students who don't produce a lot of work, it's perfectly appropriate to double dip when teaching across the curriculum and use data in 2 or more strands. But you just want to make sure if you use these samples in 2 different graphs that it's clear in the brief description how this evidence would address the skill, the standard, and the activity. So the brief description might say the student turned on technology to turn the page on a ratio and proportional story on the computer, if you were using it in math. And if the sample was used in reading informational text, the brief description might say the student turned on technology to turn the page of a teacher-made story on the computer about ratios. And of course, because it's a teacher-made text, you would have to include this illustration of the supporting documentation showing the text. And because when you use teacher-made text, it also always has to be included in the reading strand. But you can see how this piece of evidence clearly documents how the student performed those skills. So let's take a look at one more. So here's the work sample description label for a teacher documented work sample. So the measurable outcome says the student will activate a pre-recorded voice output device within 30 seconds of the reader stopping to request more during a literacy activity related to informational text. So that's what they're saying they're going to do. So let's take a look at the work and see if this is what you would expect to see. Okay. Is this what you expected to see? Is it clear what the student, how the student responded? So this is thumbnails of each page of the book. And on it, you can see that on the first page, after 35 seconds, the student was scored incorrect, but independently. On the second slide, within 20 seconds, they activated the switch, so they were marked correct and independent. And on the third slide, you can see that they were correct and independent within 20 seconds and 29 seconds, but they were prompted on that one. And then the last one, they were correct and independent at 20 seconds. So collecting students' work samples can show you some valuable information. And you can see, does the student respond to certain illustrations? Does the student have a left-sided preference or a right-sided preference? Does he start strong and fatigue, or does it take some time to warm up to an activity? All of this information is intended for you to review and make good decisions on improving student performance. So those are just some different kinds of teacher documented work samples. And if you've heard me talk before, you may have heard the story of Caroline. So Caroline was one of my students, and she had a measurable outcome about temporal words. I don't remember exactly what it was, but she was working on showing what comes next, and she was making some progress. But as with many of our kids, she was sometimes inconsistent. And I had a great parent named Susie, and she was inputting the data. I'm telling you, she was awesome. Can you imagine having a parent that's putting in your data? But anyway, so she's putting the data, and she remarked that the data was pretty inconsistent. And I just shrugged it off and said, oh, Susie, just, let it go. We've got to get this in, keep going. But Susie remarked that all of the low data points were on Tuesdays. I'm telling you, she was really awesome. Anyway, Susie said that she was going to pull out all of the teacher documented work samples to see what was going on those days. And sure enough, on Tuesday, Caroline never wanted what comes next. She was using the schedule board that we had developed for this activity as a choice board, not a schedule board. And so we brought this to the SLP, and we said, we need some modifications on Caroline's now next board to make it different than her choice board. And voila, soon enough, Caroline was choosing what comes next. So I don't think I would have had that information if I wasn't really clear on how I had made those teacher documented work samples to actually show what the choices were that Caroline had been making. Here's another work descriptor, another way that you can document student progress. So this sample shows a series of photographs, and I'm generally a little shy about using photographs as evidence. One single picture with 100% accuracy and 80% independence can't be verified because an 80% score can't be possible in a single picture. And so the educator's manual on page 30 contains additional considerations when you're using photographs as evidence. And one of the main things too was that anytime I would take out my camera, my kids would think that was the message, put your head down on your desk. But this particular series of pictures made a great work sample because it was supported with great teacher documented descriptions. So you can see that the first 4 pictures are one trial. So the student is presented with a quarter moon on a felt board. His teacher tells him to find the moon, and he requires a prompt to reach towards the board. And you can see her hand right there. And then with a prompt from his teacher, he grasps the black overlay to reveal the full moon that was partially hidden. And he removes the black overlay and he requires the prompt from his teacher. So you can see that whole first series is one score. And then the second one, his teacher tells him to find the moon. He grasps the overlay, he removes it, and he locates the full moon. So in the absence of those descriptions, it wouldn't be clear to see how the accuracy and independence was determined. But because of her descriptions, you can see the kid was 100% accurate and he's 50% independence because 1 out of 2 trials he was prompted. So that's just one more way that you can create a teacher documented work sample. So I told you that we would talk again about thinking about self-evaluation. And often teachers working at Access Skills will say, my student cannot self-evaluate, and I disagree because self-evaluation is more than did I do a good job? I mean, that's a whole lot of language. But student choice making and evaluation of one's own work are the essential components of self-determination, which is an important predictor of successful post-school outcomes. And to tell you the truth, choice making is what we do all day, giving kids some opportunities to express themselves. So think about all the choice making that you build into the activities. So choice of materials, response format, partner, or continuing or terminating the activity. So if you document the student's expressive communication response on the work descriptor label, you'll have it done. But just remember that self-evaluation is not about choosing a reinforcer. Rather, it's about choice making and having an opportunity to direct some part of the lesson. So, which materials they might want to use, or, who their partner will be. So it's about building expressive communication and self-determination. And I'm asked all the time, what do you do if the kid doesn't make a choice? And my answer is, it is what it is. I mean, you have to just keep trying and to keep it authentic. And again, there's more information on self-evaluation in the educator's manual on page 32. But let's take a look at this last slide. Oh, did you see the student's voice in self-evaluation? Yeah, keep it authentic. Those bingo dauber marks on, smiley face pictures that don't mean anything to the student. I mean, that's acceptable, but, I feel like it's really important that you always want to make sure that you're giving students authentic ways to self-express. So here's the last slide that I want you to take a look at. It was a piece of one of the teacher documented work samples that I showed you earlier, where the self-evaluation is built into the trial. And it shows a place where the teacher built in a way that they could continue or terminate the activity. And being able to continue or to direct the termination of an activity is really a powerful thing that we should be able to give our students. And I said that at one training, and a teacher said to me, well, great. So then when my frustrated teacher upends the table, you just want me to write that on the table for self-evaluation? And I looked kind of back at them and I said, well, I suppose that you could write the student terminated the activity by upending the table. But I just considered how much more powerful it could be if, when you saw those eyebrows on that kid about to blow, and you could teach him by using Mayor Johnson pictures or an adapted sign, that he could use his communication to terminate the activity before the table went over. I mean, that could be really meaningful. So try to build meaningful self-evaluation into daily instruction. And it's shown me some positive, unexpected outcomes. And with that said, I think this is a good place for me to terminate this presentation, but I'm going to stick around for questions. So if you have any questions, put them right in the chat.
And I'm just going to jump in for one moment with the skills survey. I just want to just clarify something. When we talked about the skills survey for science, there's one box that says my student cannot do this. But for all the other skill surveys, if your student is working at access level, you're going to have to, unfortunately, fill out all letter A's. So if you came to any of our other trainings, Kevin showed you, you have to do each and every line to make sure that they're filled in. So you would be doing A because A says my student isn't working at that level. Okay, just a clarification. And Laura, that was awesome. It's so much great information. So we'll take them. You want to read some of them, Laura, out loud and answer?
Sure. It looks like there's only one that I see on my screen. Last year, a teacher in my school used the format of the teacher documented work sample that you're showing, the math one with Barry. Like yours, my teacher's colleague documented work sample included self-evaluation, work, stop, not asked, and the strand was scored as missing self-evaluation, even though the teacher wrote on the work sample description page that the self-evaluation was included on the teacher documented work sample. Why are some scorers not counting work, stop, not asked, self-evaluation? And I think the answer that I would give you for that is that the portfolios are scored by human beings and not machines, and that sometimes they make a mistake. And if that was in any other area other than self-evaluation, it would have been able to be appealed, but self-evaluation is not appealed because it does not affect the overall performance score. But that teacher was right, that is a way of using self-evaluation.
That gives us an opportunity to get more feedback for our scorers for next year, and we'll be sure to train harder on that.
Does the student need to be access skills on all strands, or can they be access on some and entry points, access on some and entry points on others? I would suggest that that most typically that an entry point can most often be found within the ELA strand, because it is most often, if students have expressive communication, it may be easiest for them to find an entry point in ELA. So it would be surprising to me if the student was in math or science at an entry level, but was not an entry point at for language. But it is possible. But it's possible. Yes, each strand stands alone. But remember, within each strand, it's always going to be one or the other, because otherwise you would be mixing measurable outcomes. Could latency also be after asking 5 or fewer times? Yeah, sure. That's another way that you could do that. I'm trying to see if a student uses an eye gaze device, but we are providing the answer choices, would that be considered access skills? For example, we had an activity where we asked the student to sort shapes, circle and square, and we had to pull up the page on her eye gaze for circle and square, and she was able to choose her answers. So again, what I would ask is, what makes it right or wrong? If she's using eye gaze and you say, find the circle, and on her OptiCommunicator, she finds the circle, that's certainly an entry point. However, if you're using the OptiCommunicator and that you want to say, look at a shape, and you just want to see if she will look at a shape and you're documenting what the shape is, that would be an access skill. But from the brief description that I see here, it appears that she's using eye gaze to answer a question that's an entry point. Is that clear? Where are all the examples of the teacher? Okay, somebody else is answering that one. What are some access skill writing examples for writing? Please come to the writing access skills presentation tomorrow. I have a student who is nonverbal and has no communication device and no ability to write. He does have some entry-level math skills and entry-level reading skills, but I think we may need access skills for the writing. If you come tomorrow for the writing workshop, I think that you may find opportunities for the student to participate at an entry level. If he has, some communication skills. How does he communicate if it's not, he's nonverbal, but does he communicate with gestures or icons or tactile objects? Sounds like you might want to have a conversation with your SLP, because building a communication system, and especially an expressive communication system, should be, in my view, a top priority. Do all access skills require a latency? And I would say that it might not necessarily be a latency. For example, the sample that somebody else just put up of saying that within being presented the choices 3 times in a row, wouldn't be considered a latency. But there has to be some criteria that indicates to the person who's reviewing it what makes the score right or wrong. So there has to be some indicator that allows a score to be generated. I have a student working in the 6th grade beginning to use an AAC device. When given choices, he often is echolalic as a response or points to both options. Would this be access? To me, it sounds like it's that's one of those fine line things. I think that you want to start off with the expectation that the choices that he's making are in fact, right or wrong, and see whether or not he's able to use his device in an errorless way, or if in fact he's just emerging and is using you're collecting the data from an errorless perspective. I think that's one of those tricky ones where you're going to take the data and see. He can make some choices in response to questions he's being evaluated for a communication system. Yep, I think this is exactly why you want to have some strong data that you're going to be able to take and bring to that communication clinic and say, this is what he's choosing. This is, these are the opportunities he's had to expressively communicate, and this is how it's looking at this point. I think that the MCAS-Alt process is really going to help support developing a great communication system for this kiddo. I have a student who's nonverbal and has no communication device, no ability to write. I think we talked about that one. He does have some entry-level math skills. Okay, I think we answered that one. Can a student move from access to entry point within a strand? And we said no, remember, because that if you're changing your skill from access to entry, then you're creating a different measurable outcome. And remember, in the Forms and Graphs program, it reminds us that we can have the same skill on our data chart and our 2 pieces of evidence. So if the student does happily change from access to entry point, you're going to want to start a new data chart. The access skill is not standard connected, like turning on a computer and measuring that. So no, so the access skill, just turning on a computer switch could, in fact, it's an access skill, but turning on a computer switch for what purpose? If he's turning on the computer switch to watch a geometry game, that would be, you could use that in the geometry standard. If they're turning on the computer to read an informational text, that would be an access skill you could use in reading. If they're turning on the computer to, engage in a video about the landfills, that might be something that you could use in your science portfolio. Will you be holding a professional day for math, or is it included in the STEM professional development? I'm not sure.
I can answer that. I think people think because we do ELA we focus a lot on ELA, that there's a separate math session, but it's all together. So when we do the core concepts, ELA, math are all together. We keep science and writing separate just because they are unique. They have unique requirements, but math is included in our core concepts, which the PowerPoint is on that material site that Erin put in the chat for you.
For students with limited data, are you able to use the same dates across different strands? Oh, yes, you can. For example, that I showed you that one particular example about activating a device to participate in a ratios and proportions activity on the computer. You could use that data there. You could use the same data for reading informational text and use it in the reading stand, but just make sure on your brief descriptions on your data chart, you want to make sure that you reference how that skill of activating a switch in a computer activity relates to the standard of math and math in one and informational text in the other. Well, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. And again, if you have any questions, you can reach out to Deb, and if necessary, she can forward your contact information to me for more information.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Laura. And while Laura's done saying live questions, we'll stay for about 5 minutes more and answer any questions that come up. And again, my email is on the site along with the material site if you want to look at the PowerPoint, review that. And once that recorded session is there, we'll have a link to that. But just be patient. It does take time to edit them and get them closed captioned and then posted. So it will come, I promise. It just won't be tomorrow. So we'll stay on for about 5 minutes. We won't be saying anything out loud. We'll just answer your questions. So have a wonderful rest of your week. Tomorrow's Friday, and have a great weekend.